All right. Hi, David. Hi, Rick. Nice to see each of you. Thank you so much for joining me here
Hi, Max.
today on Vonvo.com. The date is January 20th, and we're going to be speaking about Israel Palestine. I just wanted to go over a few quick things before we get started. The first is, as you both know, this conversation is being recorded right now, and after it is finished, I'll be uploading it to our YouTube channel. Are you both fine with that occurring?
Yes.
All right, great. And just another item just to bring up is that during the conversation, this topic can get heated. And what I wanted to say is we don't want there to be any personal attacks. We want the conversation to stay civil. Are you guys both fine with adhering to those rules?
Yes. Of course.
All right, great. So let's get started. Just so that our viewers know and understand, Rick, would you mind just giving people a quick bio of yourself, and then David, you can go right afterwards.
Sure. I'm a psychiatrist. I live in Oregon. I'm working full time for establishment of democracy in the United States and world peace.
Great. And David, how about yourself?
I live in Israel, in the city of Rehovot. I consider myself an Israel advocate, and I consider that the existence of the State of Israel is conducive ultimately to world peace.
All right, great. So just to ease our way into things, we're here to talk about Israel Palestine. Obviously, the topic that we're looking to discuss today is whether or not the territories of the West Bank and Gaza are considered disputed or occupied territories. We'd also like to discuss solutions. Rick, would you mind sharing with us whether or not you believe those territories are disputed or occupied?
I'd say they're occupied. They're occupied under definitions of international law.
Okay.
Common sense.
Okay, and David, how about yourself?
Okay, well let's start. You have to look and divide this into two separate bits: Gaza and the Palestinian territories. By international law, an occupied state is a state where the occupier has police control. Israel has no control whatsoever over Gaza. There are no soldiers in Gaza. There are no police in Gaza. In fact, there are no Israelis in Gaza. Israel is at war with Gaza, though at the moment it is quiet, but it is not occupying anyone. Disputed, Israel left Gaza in 2005, so I don't think Israel has blame anymore on Gaza. So put that to the side for the moment. The Palestinian territories, what you might call the West Bank, though they have only been called the West Bank since 1967, when the Hashemites occupied, sorry, I rephrase that, since 1948, when the Hashemite kingdom occupied it and absorbed it into Jordan and had to give a name. All the historical documents before that point called them Judea and Samaria. I can find many legal experts who would say that in order for a country to be occupied, there had to be another state that actually owned it. As Jordan, which occupied the area from 1948 to 1967, an occupation which incidentally was not recognized by anyone, has decided that it no longer has any claim whatsoever over the area. I suppose legally speaking I would say it's disputed, but I don't think it matters. The reality is that Israel is in a state of low intensity conflict over the area, and I feel no more guilty about whether it's occupied or disputed than America felt in its occupation of Germany and Japan. You do what you need to do to protect yourself. The The United Nations regards the right of self-defense as the basic legal right of any state. So if we are occupying, sorry, that's a grammatical error. If we are occupying, so be it. I think also we have to realize that from a Palestinian point of view, all of Israel is occupied territory. I only heard a little bit of the discussion with Greta Berlin, but she said as much, from the river to the sea. Palestinians do not distinguish between the so-called occupation of the West Bank and the so-called occupation of Haifa, Jerusalem, Tel Aviv, and Rehovot. I think it's an argument without any real meaning.
Right. So Rick, is there anything that David said that you wanted to address that you might have a differing opinion on?
Well, yes, it's you can't compare the occupation of the West Bank to the occupation of Germany or Japan. The United States did not move settlers to either of those countries and then lay claim to them. As far as the idea that Palestine doesn't exist under international law, in fact, Palestine was controlled by the British prior to 1948, and Israel wasn't a state either. There was a partition made that did not, when Israel was granted state status by the UN, did not include the West Bank. So you can make legalistic arguments if you want about the idea that it's not an occupation, it's just a disputed territory. But if you're going to use that argument, you can say that all of Palestine, aside from Gaza, is open to Israeli occupation. And I think that the rest of the world is going to object to that. I think the rest of the world already objects to the fact that Netanyahu declared that he's going to build on E1 and take away any possibility of a two-state solution.
Firstly, from a historical point of view, Israel was not granted statehood by the partition agreement. Israel accepted the proposal. The Arabs uniformly and unanimously refused it. So it is not the boundaries are irrelevant. You cannot say the Arabs refused to accept the agreement and now Israel has to abide to an agreement which they have openly and continuously refused to accept. But let's put that to the side. What was the other? E1. E1 is important. Under every agreement that I've heard, and I'm not going to use the word settlement because settlement is a shall we say weighted term. The city Male Adamim will remain part of the state of Israel. Now, E1 is an area, a tiny area that connects Male Adamim to Jerusalem. Under any agreement, that will be so. It is not. The thing that stopped two states is not building or not building on E1. The thing that stops two states is the Palestinians, those from the side of Hamas and from the side of Fatah, and they're the important people. Both don't want a two-state solution. If the two-state solution was an answer, and both sides claim they don't want it, Hamas says straight out they will not accept a two-state solution. Fatah says that they'll accept a two-state solution until they're strong enough to militarily overcome Israel and make it one state. There is no arguing about E1 is superfluous.
Go ahead, Rick.
Yes, if you truly believe that you want to exist in peace, there's got to be a basis for negotiations. And I don't think that every statement is that Israel, they may hold that Israel has no legitimate right to exist, but that doesn't mean they won't negotiate. They've offered to negotiate without preconditions.
Excuse me, no, they haven't. Let's be realistic here. Hamas, I always mention two because there are really two parties. Hamas says straight out, no negotiation. Until Hamas is prepared to change their constitution, which says straight out there will be no negotiations, then you cannot say they're willing to negotiate without preconditions. Now, Fatah is a little bit different because Fatah has a split personality. When Mahmoud Abbas is speaking as the head of the Palestine Authority, then he says, well, let's negotiate. Of course, he doesn't negotiate, and he has used every opportunity to avoid negotiating, including the 10 months settlement freeze that Netanyahu carried out. But when Mahmoud Abbas is speaking as the president or chairman, I'm not sure of his exact title, of Fatah, he then says that any negotiations are only to the point when Israel can be overtaken by force. That's in the Fatah constitution. Now, when you have constitutional documents saying no agreement will be final, incidentally, Mahmoud Abbas has never ever accepted the idea that any agreement will be final. He's been pushed for it, and he'll never answer because no agreement will be final. Now, I'd also like to throw something in here, and I hope I'm not speaking too much because I really think there should be a discussion, that there is a whole religious element here which everyone tends to ignore but is vital. From an Islamic point of view, this is the point of view of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, this is the point of view of Hamas, it's the point of view of Hezbollah. So it's not an unimportant point of view. Israel is a blasphemy. It's a blasphemy for two reasons. One reason is the conviction that any land that was once under Islamic law, under Sharia law, remains Islamic for eternity. The other rule, which makes it a double blasphemy, is that Jews, and for that matter Christians, are what are called dhimmi, second-class citizens by Muslim law. And one of the consequences of that they will never ever accept a Jewish prime minister, any Jews in a situation of authority over Arabs.
Right.
Now, until you deal with those two problems, then there's any issue becomes very, very difficult.
Right.
And no one has dealt with those problems. President Mubarak, I'll make one more point because I realise you have to answer me. Mubarak got around this. He got around it by having his Taimi Manim make a declaration that jihad could be suspended when the opposition was too strong and Israel was too strong. So far, not even that has been accepted by the Palestinians.
Go ahead, Rick.
Please, Rick.
Well, I think it's interesting you bring up the religious argument and speak of blasphemy, because a lot of Orthodox Jews would say that Zionism is blasphemy, that God did not grant Israel in perpetuity to the Jewish people, and that to take it by force is a blasphemy. If God wants Israel to be reconstituted as a Jewish state, it's supposed to be up to God, not to terrorists.
Firstly, a lot of Orthodox Jews, no, very few Orthodox Jews say that. You have a situation in Israel where you have ultra-Orthodox political parties that are part of the system. They have come to terms with that. A very small group in terms of both percentage in the state of Israel and their percentage worldwide say that Israel can't be here until the Messiah comes. Yes, they're very, very loud, and I've never understood how they get the money to be so loud, because Neturei Karta, for example, which is the group cited for this, is about 5,000 people in total. Think about that. There are something like 5.5 million Jews in Israel. Of that, something like 3,500 are Neturei Karta. In the rest of the world, there's perhaps another 1,500 Neturei Karta. Some Jews say it, and they're a statistical tiny minority.
Right.
Well, that's interesting because, I don't really want to get into a discussion about religion because I don't think it has any place in this discussion. What we're really talking about is justice and how to achieve peace. I don't think you can have peace without justice. But the idea that just because the majority of ultra-Orthodox have resigned themselves to Zionism, or whatever the term was you used, it still doesn't make it logically consistent with Judaic tradition.
David,
and I'm not
let
I'm
Rick
not a
speak.
scholar of the Torah. All I'm saying is you can't just go by majority of opinion. Just let me finish my point, Max.
Yeah.
In the United States, when we had a civil war, the majority of the preachers in the United States thought slavery was okay because it was in the Bible. That doesn't make it okay.
Okay. The difference, and it's a very, very crucial difference, is those Jews who don't accept Zionism are not going to go to war slaughtering the Zionists. Those Arabs who do not accept Zionism are going to go to war attempting to slaughter the Jews. Power and weapons are in the hands of those who feel they have a religious right to kill Jews. And in fact, Hamas actually has twice constitutional documents kill the Jews. I think, other than possibly Nazi Germany, but I stand to be corrected, I don't think any other modern group has actually said that their aim is to kill Jews. Now, my feeling is, while this is not the only thing, and I don't want to argue theology, my point is I am arguing practical politics here.
Right,
you have a situation where a group of people, not 5,000 people as in Natura Carta, shall we say 1 million in Gaza and God knows how many in the Palestinian territories, feel that they will go to war because of their religion. None of the ultra-Orthodox are going to go to war. They're not even many of them are not even part of the Israeli army.
Right.
There's a practical difference here.
Right. So
Max.
Yeah. What I'd like to do is, here, I mean, you guys are, obviously going back and forth on a few items. In terms of some of the points that need to be discussed in order to, get back on subject, disputed versus occupied territories. David, what do you ultimately, or we'll go with Rick because Rick, you should be going next. Rick, what do you see as being necessary, in terms of the justice item you brought up? Because obviously Palestinians feel like they deserve justice, but then at the same time, David brings up remarks saying that, Hamas wants to kill Jews, so if you're going to get justice by killing Jews, is that really logical either?
I didn't catch everything you said, but first of all, I don't think you can find 1 million Gazans who want to wipe out the Jews. The people that I know who are angry at Israel are not angry at the Jews. As we've been discussing, there are Jews who are not Zionists. They're not the same thing. They are against the Israeli occupation. They are against the collective punishment of Gazans for the actions of some. They are against the whole idea that there is this endless war that justifies any means of suppressing dissent on the West Bank and in Gaza. So there's a big difference between wanting to wipe out the Jews and wanting to fight the effects of Zionism or Zionism itself. There are a lot of Arabs and other Muslims who are willing to have a two-state solution, whether or not that's the official position of Hamas or Fatah.
Okay.
So we need to start by discussing how to get to a two-state solution, or how to get to the table for a two-state solution. But ultimately, I think the only way there's going to be peace is if there is in effect one state where where people can move back and forth. There's trade between the two states, and ultimately equal rights for Palestinian, for Arab Israelis. Right now, there are a whole series of laws that discriminate between Arab, Christian, and Jewish Israelis. So one of my concerns is that if you really want democracy, you have to address those laws that discriminate. You can't have a democracy if the laws are designed to... ensure a constant Jewish majority, even if it means destroying Bedouin villages that have been there for hundreds of years, long before Israel. Um, there's a lot to talk about, but it has to start with the idea that everybody has equal rights.
Okay, you've made so many different points. Perhaps I'll sort of touch on those that I've remembered. Firstly, as to the idea that the Muslims, the Muslims, but let's just talk about the Arabs for the time being, don't want to kill the Jews. There's two problems with this. Problem number one, every opinion poll that has ever been taken says that they do. Problem number two is a majority of Palestinians voted for Hamas in the one election that they had at a time when Hamas never ever disguised its intention to go to war with Israel. So I find the idea that there's this silent majority of peaceful Muslims very, very difficult to take. Some undoubtedly exist, but the other thing is, the reality is Fatah and Hamas, or shall we say the Islamists and the nationalists, because there are groups like the Salafists, that's Islamic Jihad, who are loosely associated with Hamas, actually have a different ideology, and groups that are associated with the PLO, which Fatah is a major group, they have the arms. In other words, it doesn't really make all that much difference if there's a large of Arabs who don't want to go to war, or even if there's a majority of Arabs who don't want to go to war. War will happen whether they want to or not, because the people who have the arms want to go to war. Okay, let's drop that for a second. I want to deal just very, very briefly with the Israel situation, because I really came in here to talk about options and alternatives, and I'd like to get onto that area.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. The idea that Israel is destroying Bedouin villages that have existed for hundreds of years is nonsense. What happens is we have a situation where the Bedouin, over the last 50, 60 years, have gone from being a nomadic people who never had villages to a people who are beginning to settle. And that's problematic because they're settling on land which actually was never, and I mean during the British period, the Turkish period, and every other theirs to settle on. But I agree, the problem of Bedouin settlement, problem that has to be dealt with, is not being dealt with in a realistic way by the Israeli government. No Israeli government, it's not this specific Israeli government, has actually dealt with the problem of the Bedouin in a efficient, responsible manner. I think that's agreed. It's not the question of whether they're destroying a village, because quite frankly, if you build where you're not allowed to in any country in the world, the government, the municipality, the city will destroy that structure. But I agree, there's a problem that is not being addressed. Right. Incidentally, we're having elections in less than a week, and there's a Bedouin political party that is running precisely on that issue, which is why I find it very hard when you talk about discrimination against the Arabs in Israel. The Arabs in Israel have more rights than any other Arab anywhere else in the Arab world. We are having elections in a week, and as far as I know, there are 4 Arab political parties running. Now, sometimes I don't know exactly what they're saying, because they're political advertisements, which are put for free on Israeli television, are in Arabic, because the languages of Israel, the official formal legal language of Israel, are Hebrew and Arabic.
Right.
So anything that can be done in Hebrew can legally be done in Arabic.
Right. So
Max, you wanted to come in?
Yeah. So what I was going to say is, I mean, obviously the item of Arabs and Arabic parties, Palestinian parties being able to run in the election, then we can get into a whole debate over whether they actually have a fair chance, and apartheid. I don't want to touch those items. What I'd like to ask about is a specific question regarding disputed and occupied territories. Rick, I'll ask you the question, then we'll discuss it. But I don't know if you'll have the exact answer, so maybe we'll we'll go back to David if you don't have the answer. Do either of you know if inside of Gaza and inside of the West Bank, does the Israeli government collect taxes in either of those areas from the people that live in them?
Well, let me answer. When you say the people that live on them, you mean the Arab people, because it does collect taxes from the Jewish people. Okay.
From the
In
from
Gaza,
so
well,
so
actually,
yeah. I mean, I guess if the question needs to be broken down into Jews and Arabs, that's fine. But let's dig into this topic because if there is being taxes collected on, Palestinian people that let's say aren't in favor of how they're being treated, then I think that there's a discussion to be had about whether that is justified or not. So
okay.
I mean,
can I answer that?
answer and then let's have Rick come in here.
Can I answer that?
Answer and then let's have Rick come in.
Okay, it's a complex. Okay, it's a complex question because it really does have to be subdivided. Residents of Israel in the areas that Palestine claims are theirs. I'm specifically talking of the West Bank. I'm also talking of the Golan, which is Israel claims as part of Israel. Yes, they are taxed. Now they also have, if they want, the vote. So there's no issue of taxation without representation.
What about the Arabs, David? What about the Arabs in those lands? What about the Arabs in those lands?
Okay, in the Arabs outside, the Arabs in Gaza know there's no way Israel can collect taxes. There's no Arab presence there. The Arabs in the West Bank, excluding, as I said, East Jerusalem, which Israel has under Israeli law as part of Israel, outside that area, no, Israel doesn't collect taxes. Where Israel collects taxes from workers from the West Bank who work inside Israel.
Okay.
And it doesn't collect taxes from them, it collects taxes from the employers. Now, there was an agreement until very recently that Israel would transfer that tax money, remember this is tax money from people working inside Israel, to the Palestinian Authority. Israel, very recently, I'm not sure of the exact date, but shall we say after the Declaration of the United Nations, said that all agreements are now null and void, and Israel was now requesting to transfer that money. I doubt if there are too many taxes collected by the Palestinians. My understanding is that most Palestinians in either Gaza and the country do not pay tax to anyone.
Okay, so
the territories exist from outside. The territories exist, for example, in Gaza. Definitely do collect some sort of a percentage of any goods that are smuggled through the tunnels.
Okay.
Which is really the major income source outside of grants from overseas.
Or,
so tax is a very, very complicated question. But if it gets down to the taxation, no taxation without representation, Israel does not collect tax from anyone who doesn't have representation.
okay, Rick,
it collects taxes from the employers of labourers from Palestine who work in Israel.
Okay.
And I assume sometime in the future they will begin to transfer it back to the Palestinians. I think that's a temporary thing.
Okay, Rick, did you have a response to that? Because I guess my question to you would be, after hearing that, you live in America, what's your take on how that situation plays into the idea of, are they technically occupied if they're not being, taxed, living on that land, et cetera, et cetera?
No, I don't think that's relevant to the question of whether or not they're occupied. But maybe David can help me out on this. It was also my understanding that some of the international aid goes through Israel and that's been withheld also from time to time. Is that not true, David?
I'm not quite sure how to answer it because it depends on what is called international aid. Once again, this is a very complicated question. And once again, I have to divide Gaza from the Palestinian Authority. In Gaza, Israel does not allow anything to enter Gaza through
What's that, Stephen?
I've forgotten the word. The crossing point
Vonvo right now,
without
so
Israel inspecting it. What goes through Egypt, Israel has no control over. But through Israel, nothing goes through without inspection. And what Israel says about international aid is this. Israel has no objection to international aid with the condition that the aid goes to a specific project. We cannot give aid Gaza in terms of money. America can give aid to a specific project, whatever the project is. Israel's rationale for that is that it's essentially at war with Gaza, and it doesn't want a situation where Gaza can be assisted in making war against Israel, so it keeps control. The Palestinian Authority is a little bit more complicated. I think physically aid probably does go through Israel. I can't be certain, because remember that there are two countries bordering the Palestinian Authority. Actually three, but the two that matter are Jordan and Israel. Israel has no control with whatever Jordan allows over into the Palestinian Authority. It has limited control, let me say. I don't think there's a problem. The biggest problem about aid is it's not being delivered by anyone. That a great amount of aid, particularly from the Arab countries, is promised and never arrives because it's never sent. It's one of the complaints of Fayyad, the Palestinian Prime Minister, that he's making a budget on the basis of money that he's supposed to be given.
Right.
And the money never arrives because it's never sent.
David, Rick, I want you to reply, and then I have a question that I want to ask of the two of you that's posted from one of our listeners.
Yeah, I'm not sure I want to respond to that whole thing, but I think it really shows a problem that Israel claiming the right to control everything that goes into Gaza. I mean, they have restricted pencils for students. They've restricted building materials to rebuild the buildings that have been destroyed in the various assaults. The whole idea that this is all justified because there's a state of war overlooks the fact that one of the combatants actually has a military, and they have jet planes, and they have all the modern weapons, and the other one only has a few rockets. It's not a war so much as it's an insurgency. It's a resistance to the kind of control that Israel is claiming the right it has in Gaza in particular, but also in the West Bank, which is the military situation isn't nearly as bad there. But again, to talk about being at war with people living in the West Bank, if you don't want to call it Palestine, it's ridiculous. There's no organized resistance. And the Palestinian Authority, as you said, does the policing there. They're acting in Israel's interest there. If the Palestinian Authority truly did not cooperate with Israel, if they said, we're not going to do this anymore, if Americans were to cut off the $3 billion in direct aid and the billions of dollars in indirect aid to Israel, the Israeli taxpayer would have a hell of a situation on their hands trying to pay for the defense of the settlements and maintain a military, keep Gaza essentially as an open-air prison.
So, Rick, you bring up...
It's a police state, and I would think more Israelis should be concerned about it. That's what I'm wondering.
Well, so, Rick, you bring up an interesting item that's been discussed once, I think, on Vonvo. David, what is your take on, the international aid that should or shouldn't be coming into Israel? from America? I mean, like, do you think that oh, do you hear me, David?
Could you repeat the question? I can't hear you.
Do you hear me now?
Yes, now I do.
Okay.
Please repeat the question.
Yeah, what I was going to say is Rick brings up an interesting item regarding international aid. And as an Israeli, what is your opinion or take on the amount of international aid, let's say, that comes from America that goes to Israel? Do you believe that?
Okay.
Do you think that is making this situation a little bit more complicated in terms of who's being represented properly and whatnot?
Okay. Firstly, I believe, and I have believed for some while, that Israel should gradually wean itself away from any American aid. I believe that the Israeli economy is strong enough that over a period of 5 years, I don't think to be any longer, Israel could go from $3 billion of aid to zero. It would be in Israel's interest to do it. But the other thing is, several things are never said. Firstly, America gives aid to many countries. Now, Israel could say, and in fact I think Israel should say, we're willing, because after all America has its own economic problems, to give up American aid on the condition America stops giving $2.8 billion a year to Egypt. It stopped, which is becoming more and more of an enemy to Israel and to America. It stops giving $500 million of aid a year to the Palestinians. It stops giving something like $1.5 billion of aid a year to the Jordanians. And incidentally, it gives far, far more aid at the moment to Afghanistan and Iraq than it gives to any of these. There's an argument that it actually gives more aid to the NATO countries, but it's very, very difficult to check because the actual amounts are hidden in the defense budget. But the short answer is, I think Israel could quite easily wean itself away from American aid. But there's something that's never said. America gives aid to Israel because it's in America's interest to give aid to Israel, and I'll explain why. Firstly, Israel gives a lot back in return for America. The Pentagon has actually said that as far as they're concerned, Israel is America's largest battleship in the Mediterranean. But if Israel was not there, they would be forced to spend more money on producing their own force to do what Israel does. Simply by being there, it is saving America money. Secondly, the aid to Israel is mostly military aid, which, unlike the money given to NATO, has to be spent in America. Israel cannot, for example, take that money and go to France and buy a Mirage jet, even if it wants to. Israel is to spend that money in America. So in effect, it becomes a subsidy for American industry. Cutting off $3 billion of aid to Israel is effectively saying that $3 billion subsidy that American industry loses. Third thing, Israel has done and is doing things for America which none of the other countries who are receiving aid, sorry, I'll rephrase that, which Egypt, Jordan, the Palestinians, Pakistan, and those countries, because I don't want to talk about the NATO countries at the moment, they're a separate category. Israel is giving value for money. Now, how does that work? In many ways. And incidentally, the Congress have given reports to say exactly what I'm saying. I'm not taking it out of the air. They're saying, firstly, Israel does battle testing of American weapons.
Right.
Now, that costs testing weapons and making those weapons the most effective they can be costs billions. And Israel does it better than anyone else because they depend on their lives on that. So when Israel gets a plane and makes 300 modifications to that plane, which is what it's done on the F-16, and those modifications are all given back to, I think it's McDonnell Douglas, I can be corrected if it's not McDonnell Douglas, the company, that is a net gain to America. Now, America should be in the arms trade is another question, but America is in the arms trade.
Right.
And Israel's contribution to that trade means that the American weapons are much more popular than they otherwise would be. Now, I know I'm going on, but this is an important thing that's not dealt with.
Right. So I think
attacked the Assyrian.
Go ahead, finish your point, but I want to ask an important question follow-up.
I'd like to respond.
Israel, of course, Israel took out the Assyrian nuclear reactor in Iraq. So I can't remember the year, but it was during Menachem's period as prime minister. Saddam Hussein was building a bomb. There's no doubt about it. Now, just imagine what would have happened if, when Saddam Hussein had invaded the Kuwait, he had a nuclear weapon.
Okay.
Put a price to that.
Go ahead, Rick. Rick, respond, please.
Yeah, first of all, I don't know why we're comparing how much aid one country gets to another. The aid that goes to Jordan and Egypt, those are two signatories of treaties with Israel, and it's sort of the payoff for them not attacking Israel and actually securing those borders, particularly Egypt. The idea that Egypt is a dangerous enemy of Israel is ridiculous. Without that aid money, they would have nothing. They have a terrible economy. They depend heavily on that money. It isn't 2.8 billion; it's 2 billion, closer to 2 billion. But anyway, that's beside the point. What's more important, I think, is you made the point that it's in America's interest for Israel to be a funnel for tax money to go to the defense industry. I disagree. Defining America's interests as the interests of international corporations that are trying to control oil and natural gas in the Mideast, that's not in America's interest. That's in the interest of those corporations. And people in America know this. People are tired of spending money for the military that we don't get anything out of. The average person gets nothing out of that. Those jobs that are used weapons for Israel to use for what it calls its defense, that money could be much better spent here at home, creating jobs in healthcare, rebuilding our highways. This is not in our interest. So if you're serious about you think Israel should wean off our $3 billion plus a year, I hope you'll work for that, because I think it would be in Israel's best interest, and it would be in our best interest too.
Right, and so here's what I just want to throw out there. We've been speaking for almost 45 minutes. I do have a discussion on Syria taking place in about 5 minutes or so. We do have people inside of the room that are watching, and I'm sure would love to hear you continue going back and forth. Rick, I want to point out to you that the item of international aid, we had someone on the program a week or two ago, I think it was last week actually, who was an American living in China, and he was giving an interesting perspective on international aid. So perhaps that would be a very interesting discussion to be had at another time. But if you guys are interested in continuing your discussion, I'm sure the viewers inside the room would love to hear you continue. I know Mahmoud asked a question for both of you. It was more so pointed at David, asking him to tell you, Mahmoud is in Jordan and he is Palestinian. He wanted to know what would satisfy you to make you safe. He wants to know, should we be killing ourselves or just leave the land and accept that you are there? So ultimately, if you guys want to continue the conversation, there are people listening, and they would love to hear you continue. And I just wanted to thank each of you for coming and participating. I'll obviously upload this and be in touch with each of you soon. Is that okay?
That's fine.
It's okay with me.
All right, great. Have a good day, guys. Thank you so much.
Take care, Max.